What's in a name? That which we call a rose, by any other name would smell as sweet. While it's true that a name is separate from the object it represents, names are also often given special significance by those who create them. In this episode of Fear the Old Lore, we'll focus on the Orphan of Kos and what it represents by examining its Japanese name and what nuances were lost in translation. Some time ago, there was an interesting post on the Bloodborne subreddit from user Wojtek Izakowski titled, "Friendly reminder, the Japanese name of the Orphan of Kos is actually Goos no Ishi, which is the same." In Wojtek's post, he points out rather than using more modern kanji like koji or iji, they decided to call the orphan Goos no Ishi. This choice is a bit confusing because Ishi uses an archaic term for orphan rather than the more modern terms like koji or iji. Since koji is already used in the Koji no Kagi, or the orphanage key, it's surprising that the Orphan of Kos' name doesn't use this character as well. Wojtek's post does a commendable job breaking down the etymology of Ishi to conclude semantically it's the same as saying koji or iji. So what's the big deal? I'll admit I didn't think too much of it when I read the post at first. It made sense after all. But I wasn't thinking of the broader context of the game at the time to understand why it was important. While calling it the Orphan of Kos or Goos no Ishi wouldn't be terribly significant on its own, I think the developers specifically chose to use Ishi to tie the Orphan of Kos into themes shared in other parts of the game. I'll elaborate. In Japanese, blood echoes are called chi no ishi, which means something like dying wills of blood. It might sound a bit weird in English, but the basic idea is that they are the left behind wishes, hopes, dreams, and desires of those who've died. These wishes, or wills, remain in the blood and act kind of like souls of the dead, which makes sense in a way if we consider the game's pedigree. One of the more difficult aspects of conveying this information is that Ishi as in dying will shares the same pronunciation as Ishi, which means wills and willpower, intention, or resolve. It might not be completely clear, so forgive me if I'm being a little redundant. The Ishi in blood echoes means will from a dead person, like in a last will and testament, and Ishi can also mean will as in one's motivations, intentions, or desires. These two terms seem to come up somewhat synonymously within the game. To embolden our sickly spirit, the doll channels our Ishi or wills into strength. After killing Ram, she says the echoes or wills of the ancients course her veins. It also appears in the Erun description, which calls it the Chi no Ishi for some reason. This leads me to believe the terms were either meant to be interchangeable, or that these were nothing more than typos overlooked in development. This becomes relevant when we look at the HP stat, which is described as the power or will to survive. When we use cold blood for blood echoes or blood vials for HP, we're literally drawing power from the wills of the dead to strengthen ourselves. The two are linked. Keeping this in mind, I think the developers were trying to convey three things by calling the orphan the Ishi of Kos, in that it's the Orphan of Kos, it's the echoes of Kos, and it's the will of Kos. Obviously, Goos no Ishi can mean Orphan of Kos, but it might also represent that the orphan is akin to the blood echoes or dying wills of Mother Kos, and they continue to live on through him. It may also represent that the will of Kos in the orphan is a curse on hunters and those who've taken the blood, so that there may be
atonement for the wretches by the wrath of Mother Kos.
Unfortunately, it isn't always possible to preserve each potential meaning a word may have when translating from one language to another. It's often possible to have a technically accurate translation which fails to capture the meaning of the original. I'd like to be clear, calling it the Orphan of Kos is not inaccurate, but sometimes things get lost in translation with no one to blame. Such is the nature of the beast. After all, that which we call the orphan by any other name would still continue to scream. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking it or subscribing to my channel. Fear the Old Lore.